So, I have been working mostly in water-based media, with work centering around perception. I have a number of interesting sort of like neurological things that I've experienced for most of my life at this point. And so I've always been interested in exploring perception and consciousness. And so it seems like working with raw materials felt almost inevitable in that path, because I'm trying to really break down experience from like a microscopic level. So to work with color at a microscopic level kind of just unfolded rather naturally. Um, I started getting into making paint for my artwork about 20 years ago. Um, I had no real training, and it's something that I find when I go around and I do demonstrations at different art colleges. A lot of schools, they might have an arts and materials type of or materials and techniques type program, but they often don't really get into like the technical aspects of paint making. And so when I first started doing it, I was not very careful. I didn't really know what I was doing. I think there was some concern uh, that I was going to poison myself or do things that were unsafe, and so it wasn't really well supported or promoted. But I kind of kept on that path for a while, and uh, eventually went back to school for my master's and continued with this practice of making paint from scratch. And um, yeah, moved to New York, got a job in a pigment shop, and it all just kind of felt aligned with this interest in materiality. Um, so yeah, and then the business part of it started in 2023, really. Um, I I was working in a pigment shop in Chelsea and I was making paint there. And then when the pandemic hit, the paint making part of that stopped, and the clients that I had amassed were reaching out to me on the side and saying, "Can you just continue making paint for me?" So I kept a few of those lines open and just um, made paint on the side, but it was like, having two jobs, like every artist, you have two, three jobs or more. Um, and then eventually I had enough clients and enough demand that I was able to just do that full time. So that's what I've been doing the past 2 years.
That's great. I think we have a mutual friend in Susan Fraycon.
Oh
Um,
yeah, she's fantastic.
yeah, she was showing me some of the paint that you'd made from an historical pigment. I can't remember what it was, but she was just really getting into the color of it and how you'd, source this. I can't remember what it was. It was like this beautiful purple, this sort of earth tone purple.
Oh yeah, it might have been a
Kaput
hematite.
mortem or
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, Cuphead Mortem. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just like really, if you, I mean, like I feel like it's like the mark of a real like a painter's painters. You get really into the material of it, right? That's important.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why I love her work as well. It's you can tell um she's paying attention to not just the color but the pigments themselves. She would select really challenging colors to work with, which I do love a challenge, but I'd be grinding this metallic hematite and it's like it starts off silver and then it's slowly turning brown and it's like sweating this orange rust and then eventually it's turning purple. So it's like a real transformational process. And then to see how she's using that color in her work and how it vibrates and how it interacts with other colors is pretty spectacular.
Amazing. And in your work too, I loved the show at Ortega y Gasset, which was like it was a couple years ago
Oh,
now,
thanks.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
maybe last year. Yeah.
it just but I could tell there was some stuff happening in your paintings that were like I'm like I've never really seen pigment paint do that. There's some
Yeah, yeah.
real like wizardry happening there on just on a material level, and I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I try to work with colors that you're not going to find in an art store, colors that are maybe difficult for manufacturers to work with. They're the For that show, I covered the walls with like a black decomposed soil, like a peat soil, just because I wanted the space to be dark and I wanted it to kind of shimmer with that like natural essence of the soil. Um, and that's not something you would buy in a store just because it's particularly it's a conducive atmosphere, that body of pigment, for the growth of all kinds of things. That's why it's good for fertile soil. It's also good for growing mold and bacteria, so it doesn't last very long as a paint.
Do you use a lot of historical pigments as well, like lapis?
I do, yeah. Mostly with the historical ones, I work in watercolor. I like to work either really large or really small. And so working with watercolor is nice because you get a version of the color that looks very much like the pigment, and sometimes very much like the stone that it comes from. So, so yeah, and also it's more expensive to work with historic materials. Lapis is like the price goes up every year. It's rarer and rarer. So there is something special and intimate and kind of more like a sacrament when you're working with those kinds of materials.
Could you talk? I know lapis is probably the most talked about historical pigment. Could you talk a little bit about it?
Sure. Lapis, I mean, lapis is the best lapis comes from Afghanistan. But now there's mines everywhere. It is one of the oldest used blues in history. It was used to line the tombs of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Um, it's been ground into powder and found in the caves of Buddhist paintings in China. And it was really, because of its difficulty in processing, it was really reserved for royalty or painting specific images like the Madonna, for example. We think of like Fra Angelico blue. The sort of most well-known historic um, paint maker to develop a system for filtering the lapis was Cennino Cennini, and he essentially would grind up the stone and then through a mixture of like beeswax and mastic resin and one or two other things would make a putty and roll out the putty into these long logs and then let it rest and then put it in hot water and remold it, roll it again, let it rest and do that for a couple days. And then when it was what it was essentially doing was giving all of the impurities in the lapis, like the calcium carbonate and the pyrite and the calcite, a chance to stick to the wax and the resins in that, excuse me, in that putty. Um, and then you would put it under hot water and stretch it, and only the lapis particles would release in the warm water. And so you would let that sink to the bottom and then scoop out the first pass of lapis, and that was the highest grade. And then as you continue to do that process and continue to stretch each of these bundles, they would start to deposit more calcium carbonate, maybe a little bit of pyrite, and you'd get lower and lower grades of lapis and also lighter color because of the, the impurities that are in it. And then the final batch would be ultramarine ash, and that is a beautiful, sparkly color. It is a little bit prone to discoloration because of the exposure to pyrite, but it would get used as a sort of preliminary layer, and then the high grade stuff would get layered over top of that.
Amazing.
Um,
S-
yeah.
So, how much chemistry do you need to know to do this?
Oh man, I probably need to know more. I'm such a physical science person. I pay close attention to like the behavioral aspects of paint. I did not love chemistry. There was too much math in it when I was in high school, and in art school we didn't have to do any chemistry or science. And now I'm like, God, I wish I paid attention a little better, Mr. McCluskey. My apologies. But there's
Well,
a lot of
you
science to it.
you got this far.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I've made it this far.
so what are some unusual pigments historically and some has there been a danger of toxicity in your like from a historical standpoint and currently and using synthetic pigments?
That's a good question. For me, there's not too much risk. If I'm working with things that I know contain lead or arsenic or cobalt or cadmium or something, I do them in small batches under a vented booth with gloves and respirator and goggles and everything. Um, Verdigris is maybe one of the more popular, well-known sort of toxic materials. Van Eyck really popularized the use of that color. A lot of artists took a stab at it and would have issues with it darkening, turning black. Um, a lot of things that are copper based tend to be sensitive to humidity. So if they aren't coated properly or varnished, they would be susceptible to that kind of a change. I make verdigris into watercolor. I am interested in how it changes, how the paintings change as they age. Sometimes I'll maybe spray a type of varnish or something, but I do try to embrace what the pigment does naturally. Another example might be pyrite. Um, Pyrite is beautiful, sparkly silver, and it oxidizes when exposed to water. Um, oh, it oxidizes when exposed to oil too. It does some pretty spectacular things. It'll turn bright green. It'll develop a yellow powder on its surface that can wipe off. It releases sulfuric vapors when exposed to water, so it's a little bit smelly. But it also, as humidity changes, it can actually corrode the surface that it's on. So you get these really nice orange rusty halos around your marks. And I kind of fell in love with that pigment around the time of the pandemic. And I did a series of paintings, very linear with the pyrite. And I put it in a drawer and came back to it months later, and all of the contour lines had completely disintegrated, like a termite ate through the paper, which I thought was pretty spectacular. And then I took the delicate pieces and tried to mount them and use them for something else. But
I love
yeah,
that. It's like painting, well, painting like the pigment itself, just like painting, just like the whole process is really a living thing.
it really is. It is. And with the natural materials, it just kind of reinforces that. I like that it's a collaboration. It's whether it's art and perception and consciousness or like raw materials and paint, there seems to be that symbiotic relationship.
Absolutely. So it seems like your interest in consciousness sort of led you to looking at paint on a or thinking about it in a more sort of in a finer way, like really sort of trying to get at the sort of core of what it is.
Yeah, I mean, your work as well. You seem also pretty intrigued by consciousness, which is what drew me to your work.
Thank you for saying
Yeah.
that. I feel like that's really the base. I've been sort of interested in the idea, which I think is it's getting a lot more traction, even scientifically, that consciousness is the base and then physical
Yeah.
reality is on top of consciousness. And this is what
Yeah.
any advanced meditator would tell you. Any mystic would, of course, see that very clearly.
Yeah.
But for the rest of us, I think it's a kind of a challenge to think on those terms.
Yeah, yeah, right. We still have to wake up at a specific time and get in a car or on a train and go to work. It's easy to get distracted.
But I think painting is a beautiful sort of bridge between the physical and the conscious and things, seeing things on a consciousness level, right? Because you're dealing with sort of it's kind of liquid consciousness in a sense, or the powder and the pigment. I love that you're really going into the actual like the stuff. What is like beyond just the paint? So it's the pigment. It's really going into what are the real qualities of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I do think there is something changes. When I'm painting, I feel like I'm more able to get into that sort of fluid state and that realization that consciousness is the real driver of everything. Um, and there's this kind of like handing over to the materiality. Like I like the idea of fluid thinking because when I'm painting, even when I'm drawing, if the tool I'm using has that kind of perpetual flow, like a marker or a ballpoint pen or something, it's easier for the body to sort of get behind that gesture and get into that rhythm. And then paint is like another avenue for that. It's a little bit broader. You can spread things out. Um, but it really is still sort of facilitating this idea of fluidity. Um, there's a really beautiful material. I work with this azurite. It's from Japan, and they filter it through a process called centrifugal elutriation. And they basically take a bunch of pigment particles and they put them in these silos that have a little opening at the bottom and the top. And they either run a jet stream of a fluid or a gas, and they set it to a specific pressure so that it can only lift particles that are of a certain molecular weight. And so what happens is it's collecting the particles by their shape and size. And so when you gather them up, you can separate them and say, oh, these are 30 to 60 microns, these are 90 to 100, these are 120. And when you see even something natural, when the particles are of uniform size, the vibration of the color intensifies. So I'm looking at this natural mineral that you would never be able to process even through navigation on your own. But with this technology, you're able to see it vibrating in a way that looks synthetic. It looks supernatural. So I kind of love how these interventions with technology can sort of facilitate our ability to evoke new kinds of consciousness with something that's historic, with something that's natural or mineral. So
Mm. Do you use a lot of synthetic pigments in your work?
I do. I think I have a pretty healthy mix. I'm really drawn to earths. I use a lot of like red ochre is like among my favorites. Um, a lot of natural iron oxides, a lot of minerals, but there's just so many interesting synthetics, and they keep inventing them every year that it's like almost impossible to ignore them. And they all have very interesting, diverse characteristics as well. So I try to have an interesting mix of the two.
Is it true that a lot of these were developed by the auto industry?
A lot of them are, yeah. And sadly, like when they decide they don't want to paint a car a specific shade of red or yellow or something, that pigment often is discontinued by the chemical companies that produce for the auto industry. They're like the main driver. There are instances where there's enough demand for a color from art companies, but they make up such a small percentage of the manufacturing that oftentimes they disappear, and then those companies will just come up with a mixture, or a new color might get synthesized the next year or something.
It's amazing. I suppose we have to talk a little bit about Indian yellow, the history of that color.
Oh, okay. Sounds good.
Maybe you can correct me, or I'm not sure if I'm mistaken or if this is just lore, but the myth I've heard, or the myth or the story I've heard, is that they fed mango leaves to cows and dehydrated
Yeah.
them, and they had sort of had to force the pee out of them, which became Indian yellow. Is there some truth to that?
There's this really good book on color by Victoria Finlay, and she goes on a journey to this village where this was supposed to have happened. And she is asking people, trying not to step on toes, because it's a very strange thing. And everyone she mentions this process to either erupts into laughter, or they just are so confused, or they think she's crazy. Um, she could not confirm that. There's like one account of a colorman who was collecting pigments in that region, and he described witnessing them collecting the urine and then seeing these bundles, these balls of what looked like soil, and also describing the smell of them. But there's not that I know of. I don't think there's any actual confirmation of that. But like you, I've always heard that story that this is where Indian yellow originates. And of course, now we're lucky we have the synthetic version that looks so much like it. You don't have to venture into collecting cow urine.
It's a beautiful color, though.
It's so beautiful. It's one of my favorites.
Same. So what are some paints? What are some pigments that we use that might have been are there some pigments that have been used in the in like historical cave paintings? And what are some of the oldest pigments
Mm.
that
Yeah,
are still
so
in use or were used at the time?
yeah, like red ochre is probably the oldest recorded used painting. There are carvings that were found in Africa that are hundreds of thousands of years old that indicate they were using chunks of ochre for sculptures. And then, of course, all of the cave paintings contain limonite or a version of red ochre and chalks. Um, the thing that's so fascinating to me is there's all these different ways that they came up with to bind the pigment so that it would stay. Um, but a lot of it was experimental. So like early paintings could have been made with spit and mud or some type of cellulose from plants, um, blood, urine, animal fat, fish eggs. These are all used to be mixed up with pigments to get them to adhere. And a lot of those things are rewettable, and so they would wash away. The reason we have these 100,000-year-old cave paintings and even older is because we're lucky enough that the caves were made of limestone. And so as the caves were exposed to changes in humidity, they would secrete a kind of calcium hydroxide that would affix the pigment to the wall like a fresco. So these are like the oldest frescoes, but they were just inadvertently frescoes. Um, but so yeah, those would be the oldest, and I maybe that's also why I work with those pigments still. I kind of feel like when I'm painting, I don't use technology. Uh, I'll say I don't use computers and things like that. Of course, I use technology because I rely on modern advancements to get such great grades of pigments and paints. But I really do try to zone out and not be influenced by the things that are sort of gnawing at us and chirping in our ears all day. And I think of that as being somehow connected to those cave paintings. Like there's this really beautiful, sort of mystical, maybe transcendental experience that you're having with this really simple material that comes from Earth, and it's definitely alive, and you're learning as you're doing it. And I think I have a kind of reverence for those natural materials, and it's easy to sort of um, fall in love with that process and that color and those materials.
I think that reverence comes out in your work.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's important, whatever sort of wherever we're at on a consciousness level, that's reflected in one's artwork. So I think it is really important. Like I think often what pigments or the the quality of pigments or the quality of paint or what it is exactly is um not really uh considered as much as I think maybe it could be in among artists because that's such an important part of it. It's a huge piece of it. The importance. I mean, I don't know if this is maybe you can correct me about this too. I've heard that a lot of the pigments found in these cave paintings were taken from many miles away
Yeah,
on foot. So they would have had a deep reverence for the materials then.
yeah, absolutely. And there were, real conflicts that emerged as a result of territories being taken over by colonizers who would restrict the access to the mines and try to uh, take over a cheaper version of a color to sell to Aboriginal artists. And they knew that it didn't contain the levels of mercury that gave this particular red ochre its luster. And so it wasn't just about the sparkle to them. They felt like there was the spirit of the earth from the mines was essential to making this work. And so, yeah, it's amazing what the pilgrimages, the sort of the real reverence that has existed for these really special materials throughout history.
It's amazing. Yeah, there's so much richness and so much depth to color itself. The stuff. What is it? There's just so
Yeah.
many. There's it seems like
Mhm.
unlimited too. And you mix this thing with you put a little thing with it, and you get this amazing sort of just the whole process. It's remarkable.
It's completely unlimited. I feel like every week I mix two things together and I'm thinking, how have I done this for 20 years and never thought to combine this French ochre with this synthetic blue? Like it's just limitless. It's like music. You have all the notes, but you can recompose and reconfigure and make new music forever.
Yeah, it's amazing. So what are you working on now,
Uh, art wise, paint wise.
art wise?
Art wise, I started working on these large scale paintings again, some 8 foot by 6 foot uh, immersive kind of spaces. Um, I I've been thinking a lot. I mean, I'm always thinking about vision, but I've been thinking, like what you were saying earlier, how whatever is happening in the world is going to be present in your work. And I keep a sort of bedside journal, sketchbook that I contribute to as often as I can. Um, and it's a little bit easier by hand to sort of scroll out these anxieties and fears and hopes and things for what's going on in the world and what you want to see. Um, and so I've been trying to use drawing through paint on these larger scales. So I've developed these drawing tools that are essentially like um, plastic bottles with a ball, like a deodorant roller, essentially. Um, and then I fill them with paint, and that allows me to draw at a larger scale. So I have the fluidity of like a ballpoint pen, but on like an 8 foot scale. Um, and then a little bit with airbrush to also facilitate that ease of gesture that I get from just, small handheld drawings. Um, the content, it's it's messy because it feels like the world is messy right now. But when has it not been? But there is a kind of sense of like I'm exploring what it is to sort of wake up in a space and have this experience or this vision that feels like it's somehow I'm trying to think of how to put it. It's an experience that feels like it's exactly as it needs to be. And maybe it's like why painting feels like a space for reverence because it's like you don't have to question it. And so when I'm working and it's sort of coming to me, I'm usually turning off the thinking and I'm trying to access that space where I can really trust myself and trust what I'm witnessing. Um, and so it is probably more abstract. There's definitely imagery that comes through. Um, there's a lot of eyes. I feel like eyes are a recurring image that keeps coming up. Um, but yeah, that's what I've been up to lately. And then for color, I'm exploring a bunch of yellows, oranges, and golds at the moment.
So it sounds like the process is quite intuitive.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
very much.
And what like is there also a crossover if you're making a bunch of a certain color as a paint maker, does that sort of bleed into your studio process?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the nice thing is I work with all the colors already, so when people are kind of looking for something specific, I kind of have access right away. Um, but yeah, I the nice thing is if I know I'm making colors for people, it's easy to throw in an extra 100 grams for myself and I've been able to facilitate the practice because paint making is a bit labor intensive for an artist. And like up until 100 years ago, artists made their own paint or they had someone in the studio able to make it for them. Uh, but there was at least a knowledge of how to do it. And then with industrialization, we haven't had to do that. We've got the tubes that you can bring with you for plein air painting. You can just go to the store and pick things up. And so to be able to incorporate the aspects that are in my practice as part of the business as well has been like a real saving grace.
Are you grinding it up by hand?
Depends on the volume. If I'm doing like gallons, I'll usually use the 3-roll mill. If I'm doing watercolors, I usually do by hand. Oils, depending on the pigment, I might do by hand. The wheels are great. They incorporate and homogenize, but there are certain colors that they're just very gritty and granular, and they benefit from really being ground up
With
under a
a
glass muller.
with like a mortar and pestle.
Mortar pestle, sometimes if I'm doing like fluid things like shellac inks, and then glass muller and glass palette when I'm doing like oil paints.
So perhaps you could walk me through. So say I come into your shop and I want like let's see, I want like 5 big tubes of let's just say lapis, what
Uh,
like and I want it bound in sunflower oil. How would you do that?
okay. Oh yeah. First, I would say don't use sunflower oil because it won't dry properly.
Okay,
Then
linseed
I might
oil.
say linseed, maybe walnut, poppy oil. Um, well, so it's usually cost of material. So depending on how much material is needed to fill a specific size. So I'll give estimates for that. And then um, it's really just the cost of materials and then a labor fee depending on the grade of the difficulty. So the same way an art company might label something series one, series two, series three. Dioxazine is really difficult to work with, so that would be a longer labor, so it's going to cost more to process versus like ultramarine blue synthetic is just like I can do that in my sleep practically. So that would be a much cheaper pigment, and it is also a cheaper pigment. So it's like the labor and the cost of material would be less.
So ultramarine basically lapis, is it lazuli or lazuli? Lazuli.
That's a good way. It has so many iterations because it's comes from multiple languages. I always say lazuli, lapis lazuli. Yeah.
Lapis lazuli. Was that so basically that's ultramarine, right?
Yes. Yeah. So ultramarine essentially just means beyond the sea, and it's because the best lapis was being imported from Afghanistan, um, to Greece, to Rome, to all the sort of ancient cities. And now we call ultramarine the synthetic and lapis for the stone, but that was historically what it was referred to as.
And when was ultramarine synthesized?
Oh, wow.
Like
Let's
19th
see.
century, something like that?
I think a little earlier. Oh, maybe 19th century. I'm thinking Prussian blue, I think, was the 1700s. But I think lapis was actually around a similar time frame, maybe the 1800s. There was a competition in France, which is why it's French ultramarine blue,
Mm.
um, to see who could synthesize a color in it. When you see it, it's like it's really hard to get actual lapis lazuli that is as vibrant as ultramarine. I've seen it. I've seen like the Frau Angelico blue, usually in egg temperate. It has the best refraction. And it's pretty spectacular, but it's really hard to get it to that point.
I see. Yeah, I see. Yeah, have you seen, so when you go to a museum, are you kind of looking at
Yeah.
things from a pigment standpoint?
Sometimes, I mean, yeah, I guess I always am at this point. I'm saying sometimes, but it would be hard to go to a museum and not be curious about what they were using. And then that's one gripe I have about museums. And it's a shame what was that Buddhist museum on 17th Street?
Ah, the Rubin
Uh,
Museum. Oh,
the Rubin Museum was such a shame
R.I.P.
for them to close. Yeah, right. That
Oh,
was such a great place.
it's
They
beautiful.
actually had displays that showed you like the malachite,
I
the
saw
cinnabar, the
those. Yeah, I
ochres.
remember that.
That was really cool. I wish artworks would have that list. I know conservators often know what those things are. I'm not sure why it's not more shared with the audience. I feel like not just pigment nerds, but like people would be curious to know
Yeah.
what materials are being used.
Yeah, and the
So,
process they had that process in that little back room. They showed the process of a Tonga painting. Am I
yes, how
pronouncing that
cool is
right?
that?
Like
I think
it's
so.
Tonga.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, like a
Yeah.
Tibetan traditional Himalayan style art. That was a
Yeah, like
beautiful museum.
high gluing
Yeah,
pigments. Oh,
yeah,
it was my favorite. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's and that shrine. Yeah, that
Yeah,
like
yeah.
man. Well, we at least we got to experience it,
Exactly. Thanks for that.
And the Met's still there, so that's
They're still
that's
there,
good.
and
They're
I think
still
they have some areas with pigment displays, but yeah, that would be a nice broader project to get them to reveal what they know.
yeah. So back to the project. So I've come to you. I want
Yeah.
these 5 tubes of lapis. What would you suggest maybe using ultramarine instead? Like, hey,
No,
like
no, not at all. I would say first I would show you a bunch of swatches. I keep diligent notes and swatch cards. I've got hundreds of samples that I will show people first. And then for lapis in particular, it doesn't age as well in oils. So usually a lighter oil is preferable. In linseed, it's going to be more navy blue and it actually can continue to darken over time. So something lighter like poppy oil or walnut might work a little bit better. But egg tempera and gum arabic solutions are going to give you the purest version of that color. And egg tempera is like preferred by conservators.
hmm,
When I tell conservators that I work with acrylic, they sort of furrow their brows because it's a material that's modern and we don't know how it's aging. And we know the stuff from the 60s and 70s is either experiencing liquefaction or powderizing, and they're just having to invent technology just to hold on to the work from that period. Um, I think about those things, but I can't let that interrupt how I work. To do egg tempers at 8 feet by 6 feet would stink up the whole studio, and it's that access to the fluidity that we were talking about is really limited. Also, the cost of eggs nowadays. Who's going to do an 8 foot egg temper paint?
just get on down to Costco. They're still reasonable
Yeah,
over there. Um,
that's
so
true.
so like for example, like so some famous. I'm surprised to hear that egg tempera has lasted so well. It seems like it would be more fragile.
You would think, but on panel especially, it's a protein that really doesn't shift very much in terms of coloration. And proteins, as binders, they tend to harden with time, so they actually can get stronger. A lot of the crackling that we see in paintings that were done with like a protein binder, like rabbit skin glue, for example, it's because they weren't mounted on panel. So a lot of the things that we see have been stretched or at least resting on panel. um, because that reduces the amount of flex that you're getting from the linen or the cotton.
I see.
But yeah, egg temper's the way to go.
Well, I saw it I'm doing a version of like a series, I guess, of based sort of inspired by various Annunciation paintings, historical
Oh, cool.
paintings. And one of them, of course, is Fra Angelica's Annunciation, which is in the Prado, and that
Yeah.
has I I think it is egg tempera, right? And it has
He did work in egg temper.
he
Yeah.
worked in egg tempera, yeah, but it's just beautiful.
Yeah.
It's the colors are are still vibrant, and
Yeah, it's
I
insane, right?
yeah. And there's that lapis coming out again. Just I think he just used it in sections. It must have been quite expensive.
Yeah,
At the time, I heard it was more pricier than gold.
it was. Yeah, at that point, I think it was more expensive than gold. But
Such a beautiful
yeah,
painting, though, really. And
I
you just
know.
really it still has the same. If you make something anything that somebody will hold on to for longer than like one generation, I think you've succeeded. I was
I
recently
agree.
yeah, my grandfather was a painter, and we have like a few of his paintings left, because we just for sentimental. He was pretty good. He never really trained. He never
Yeah,
really
yeah.
like. He was basically a hobbyist. But um, I mean, we're not. Those are going to go in the garbage as soon as like the next generation comes around. Nobody's going to want these
Right,
paintings.
right.
But if I could make, I feel like if you can make one or two things that
At last.
somebody that lasts, that somebody
Yeah,
will be like, actually, I can't throw this away. That you just make something that like so much stuff out there. And I don't mean to throw shade on contemporary art at all. Some amazing stuff, beautiful stuff. I'd never make a blanket statement condemning it on any
yeah,
level,
yeah,
but so much of it out there is you're like, I go to shows like, and I'm like, that's going to be in a dumpster in like 10 years
yeah,
tops,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and some of those things are falling apart presently, and it's like we've been in this contemporary space for such a short time. If the paintings are falling apart already, I mean, unless that was really a conceptual aspect of the work, maybe it's important to do a little more research before you just throw something together. I do think there's something to be said for these historic processes that do last, and so um, like oil paint really historic oil paint is so much stronger than contemporary oil paint. There are so many things that are done to oil paints today to make it easier for these companies to run them on a gigantic set of mills. They'll add additional acids and oils and things that force the pigment in the binder to behave in a uniform way because it's easier to fill the tubes and to get it to behave and make it not dry out. Um, and we're now finding that because of all these additives, the paints are more susceptible to humidity and discoloration. And this was something I think Rublev just released a bunch of this research. It was so nice to hear that because people often wonder why would you make paint from scratch or why would someone want bespoke paint, and it really is about controlling the ingredients. If you have just pigment and oil, that's oil paint and that will last hundreds of years if it's done properly and you don't need a whole bunch of additives. um, and so yeah, if you want to make things that last, it does help to have a little bit of concern about materiality.
So will even like artist grade paint companies add stuff to make it more, what would you call that? Just more viscous or more like just more
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Just to affect the rheology, how it spreads, how it holds specific peaks. I mean, the thing that's funny is like pigments have their own characteristic behaviors, and so for these companies, they are trying to make it easy so that when you open a tube of red, yellow, blue, purple, or green, they all have the same consistency. Well, when you do that, you're kind of subjecting the pigment to a series of transformations that push it further away from its innate characteristic and closer to the gelling agent characteristic or the modifiers or, the things that make it flow in a specific way. And now we're finding that all of those additives are not necessarily the best thing. It's like putting additives in your food. You're not really getting just the nutrients from the food. You're not getting just pure pigment and binder. Um, so we'll see if they make any changes. I know certain companies, Old Holland, Rublev, Michael Harding, they tout the fact that they are making pure paints with minimal additives. I'm a fan of that personally for my own work.
I only buy organic paint.
I only buy organic paint.
It's very much healthier. But I like that analogy though of like food and paint. It's like because we put so much stuff in the processing of food that we don't even know it's for various reasons, like gelling agents. A lot of
Right.
it is to make the food more palatable, of course, more addictive,
Yeah.
and more,
Yeah, right.
tastier. And so it's getting to the point where it's like we have. I looked at. I work with some these guys out in Jersey that sometimes will eat very processed foods, and there was one like package of, I think it was like I think it was a kind of like it was Doritos or something. I don't remember exactly what the snack was, but it had like 50 ingredients. I'm not even exaggerating. It
Yeah.
was something insane, and I was just like, I don't even know what that is. Like, nobody knows
Yeah.
what that's doing to the body.
No.
So in the same way, it's like people are just putting all this stuff in the paint, and they don't know how what's gonna happen. They don't know what the downstream effects are.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but also it seems like you're getting further away from uh like I think you mentioned just a minute ago about the qualities. It's like getting further from what the paint wants to do. It's like
Yeah.
we're
Yeah, like I
yeah.
understand it. But it's like if you've got a bottle 10,000 tubes of paint in 27 colors, it's easier. Like it's the same logic with instead of there's hundreds and hundreds of pigments you could use, but it's easier for a company to buy 10,000 pounds of phthalo blue and Hansa yellow and use that for red, for their blue, for their yellow, and for their green. So a lot of colors are just mixtures of the same 20 or so pigments. But there's hundreds and hundreds to choose from, so it's kind of seems silly to limit and restrict your choices. And it's for me, it's the same with the behavior of the colors. Like one of my favorite pigments is this RTZ yellow, and it's like a really opaque yellowish orange, but it's very stodgy. It behaves like cornstarch when you're working with it in water-based paints. And so if you just add a whole bunch of gelling agent, you could get it to spread and be easy like some other color, like a Hansa or another pigment. And so I understand the appeal of like wanting to make things easier, but then maybe there's an interesting workaround where because it behaves in this pooling way, you could make paint that loses its brush strokes. You could make something high flow, or you can reserve it in a way that you're using not just the color, but the physical characteristics of the paint to inform how you work with it and what the painting looks like ultimately.
So this would be a natural pigment, not synthetic.
This one is synthetic. It's titanium, zinc, what is it? RTZ, rutile, tin, zinc,
But it
yellow.
still behaves in its own.
Um,
It has its own properties, even though it's a
it has its
synthetic.
own properties. Yeah, exactly. And like lots of synthetics behave very differently. Some as you wet them, they foam and accumulate a weird amount of volume, and then you have to like degas them in a chamber. Um, Others are just pool naturally. They just want to settle. And so I find when I'm reaching for a color, I'm not just thinking of the color. I'm also aware, oh, if I use this, when I spread it, it's going to leave all these air pockets, and that might be interesting if I go back on and layer it with something else. Or so I like to think of color in a very physical way also.
They're alive, aren't they?
They are definitely alive, even the synthetics. And they
Amazing.
vibrate and they have particle charge, and you have to sometimes cut them with alcohols or wetting aids to break the surface tension if they're hydrophilic or hydrophobic, or there's a lot of different qualities that all of the materials have, and they're not necessarily all shared.
I love that you approach painting in that way. Like you're really considering the qualities, the inherent qualities of the pigment in your work, and obviously in your when you um are working with them professionally, like making paint with them and also in the studio.
Thanks. Yeah, I find that interesting. Not all clients want that. Sometimes people are like, I love this color, but I don't want it to behave like cornstarch. So I totally understand that. And there's so many different workarounds that can still be interesting. Like just because you're modifying the paint it's not necessarily a bad thing. All additives are not created equally. All chalks are not created equally. You can add like 40 different stone chalks and they all will do something slightly different to the paint. So I think if anything, it gives you more options. It gives you more potential to explore the color in
It's a
like
whole, it's a
physical and
whole,
visual ways.
it's a whole, it's a whole another dimension that I think is very, it's rarely
It
explored.
really is. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I feel like I see a lot more DIY. I see a lot of people investing in making their own paints. I teach a lot of workshops to people, a lot of young artists in art schools and art programs are very curious and very interested. I teach part-time at Cooper on materials and techniques, and to just show up and see what they're working on and offer like 20 different things that they could explore, and then to see how they implement it is really rewarding. So I hope people keep pushing in that direction.
I hope so too. And I think, you know, I appreciate the work that you're doing, because this is something that, this is all, uh, of a whole lot of things that I think is very rarely considered. And I think you're, by teaching it and by putting it out there, I think you're really doing, artists and everybody else a real service.
Oh, thanks. I hope so.
No, it's important. It's important. It really makes me think about sort of getting at, like we talked about earlier, like really getting at the qualities of something on a consciousness level. But so to that point, do you have some sort of, do you have some meditation practices or spiritual practices that sort of also inform your work?
I, I for years had a much better meditation practice. New York kind of really has put that to the test. Um, it's hard to find quiet places unless you get out of the city. My studio is nice. It doesn't have windows, but it's a concrete box, and I can lock the door and put in noise canceling headphones or just earplugs and sort of zone out. And so when I'm working, there is usually at least a portion of that time spent just sitting, breathing, and trying to eliminate the thinking. I think that's maybe the number one aspect in the work. And so um, repetitive mark making, tapping on the surface of the canvas, even if it's things that are going to get covered up afterwards, it's like a kind of way to initiate contact with the painting, with the surface, and also it gives my sort of visual cortex something to respond to. There's dots of color on a surface that is colored or blank or whatever. Um, and then I guess like I've always been intrigued by entheogens and entheogenic research. Um, so I do explore that in different ways in the work. Um, Also, I like keeping the dream journals and the sketchbooks. It's also just a way for me to kind of take stock of the like strangeness of my own perceptual experience. So I have visual snow syndrome, which means I see particles all the time. Like when you close your eyes and you press on your eyelids and you see like pressure phosphenes. I just always see that, and didn't know until like later in life that that's not how everyone else sees. Um, I would stare into a dark room and see like red, yellow, and blue spots just vibrating in the space, and I just thought that's vision. That's how everyone sees. And so I've spent the past like eight, 8 or 9 years like really trying to pay close attention to that. So I'll sometimes work in a really dim lit environment, maybe one light bulb in the back of the space. So it's really hard to see the color or the shapes on the canvas. And then I'm having this sort of collaboration with the sort of visual field in like a real actual way. Um, and then another sort of thing that's been like a point of focus in the work is I have some sleeping conditions where I wake up and the dreams are still happening, but I'm paralyzed. So I have hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. Um, I've had that since I was 16. It kind of comes and goes. There's years where it happens 50 or 60 times a year. And then there's years where it only happens a handful of times. But there's something about the experience of other, like this thing that you know it's coming from you, from your consciousness. But when like a shadow figure walks up to your bedside and tilts its head, it feels very much like it's not from you. It feels like you're the one being observed. And so when I'm working, I'm trying to reduce the thinking. I'm trying to get out of my own way, and I'm trying to let that experience of otherness happen, manifest through materiality, through color, in ways that are organic, so that I'm not just you know, imbuing the work with my mark and my ego and my sense of what it should or shouldn't look like. And so I think that's also why it's very intuitive.
So you would say that the work is a meditative practice.
I feel, yeah, yeah, I definitely think so. I also feel better. It's like an energy shot. When you've had a good night of painting, the next day, all the aches and pains are gone. My sense of self-worth, not that that's the primary function, but like your happiness, your general acceptance of things as they are is present. And then of course you get to the studio and you critique it right away. The ego comes back and you're like, this is all shit. I gotta keep working. So it's not a
Yeah,
guarantee for success, but it is amazing how it has that. It really it brings with it a kind of energy that is vital. So yeah,
absolutely. It's really about the process, and
yeah.
connection.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, you're making contact. Yeah, it doesn't matter if you know with what. I think we're all tapping into it, but I often refer to like the that unknown space as the well. I like to think the well is infinite. There's like you can always go back to the well and draw something fresh from it, something you haven't seen before. I kind of love that that's the reality. Like you really, it's infinite. You just have to spend some time with it.
I love that term. I think it's the same thing that Rick Rubin refers to as the source. I don't know have you read
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, Creative
No, I
Act?
didn't read it. No, no, but it's on my list. Yeah, I agree. It's the source, definitely.
I feel like you have this sort of hidden communication with paint through via pigment, right? It's like you're
Yeah.
have you ever read any Ursula Le Guin? Do you know
No, I
the
don't
the
think so.
Wizard of Earth? She wrote she started she must be, I'm not sure if she's still alive. She wrote in like the 60s, 70s and beyond, but she had this series of books called The Wizard of Earthsea, like a high fantasy sort of Tolkien Lord of the Rings-esque. But she
Okay.
talks about these wizards knowing this hidden language, like the
Mm.
language of making, I believe they
Oh,
called it.
wow.
But it's like this sort of the true name of things. It's like understanding the true name of things is a kind of power. And I think
Yeah.
understanding the real, like really connecting with the materials is a real kind of power in your work.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I love that. I often think about like if you can if you can reduce this urge to identify forms, you can really kind of levitate in this space of formlessness. And that's a really, I feel like that's a really fertile ground to make work in because as soon as you identify it, like sometimes that's why I'll work in the dark or I'll work so close that I don't step back, or when I step back, I look down so that I don't see the painting. I try to really leave a space for potentiality to flourish so that I'm not jumping to that identification. And in some ways, I think that's really interesting. Like to think that you can know the thing better through this act of embodying it. It's like almost like you're capturing its true essence as opposed to this sort of schematic version that we impose on it.
Yeah, it sounds like you maybe can get at that through sort of perceptual alteration, like changing your perception might give you a more
Yeah.
clear picture.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. I think for a while I was afraid that like if I was using entheogens, I would be stirring up this like the sleep paralysis or the waking dream hallucinations and whatnot. But so far that has not been the case. I think it's more about like finding the methods and techniques and materials uh, that help to clarify things and help to sort of clear away the debris and make it easier to move forward with the ability to not like get in your own way or to let the sort of cacophonous realities sort of crowd the work and influence you too much.
Yeah, I think it's a tool, right? I mean, not
Yeah,
only not
totally.
not only a tool, but it is something that can help you in your life and in your process.
Yeah. And I mean, it's ancient, it clearly has done wonderful things for civilization. So
I wonder if
I'm all
those
for it.
yeah, I wonder if those cave painters were dipping into a
You
little bit
know,
of a
I
yeah.
I think they definitely were, but that's just I don't don't know.
Of course, this one thing that we've done as humans, that's one trait that we always, I think, consistently throughout history have wanted to alter our consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And whether we desired it initially or it happened accidentally, uh, that doesn't really matter to me. There is something that happened. Also, I mean, I'm sure you've read these kinds of things like Gordon Wasson and Terence McKenna. They talk about like, the enlightened ape or whatever. But
Oh, the stoned ape.
this, the stoned ape, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I liked how Gordon Wasson talks about like the sort of patterning that happens as a result of these substances, whether it's a mushroom or a vine or whatever. It has this characteristic that we all share in collectively. Like there are certain types of mushrooms that will make you have visions of tigers, or, in the case of like ayahuasca, you're going to see crawly things and snakes. And, there's something interesting to me about what's embedded in
Yeah.
those materials that we get to then go into that space and understand it from the perspective of the plant instead of separating ourselves. That's like the main problem, right? Is thinking that we're separate, we're not all connected. Makes it easier to inflict harm and to set up distances and be greedy and all of the things that are, you know, that seem so futile and such easy problems to solve, but we somehow can't.
That's it. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's the illusion of
Mm,
separateness. That's what keeps us
yeah,
all, and it's it's just not helpful for anybody. You don't feel,
it
how do
really
you feel?
isn't.
How do you feel? You don't feel good.
Yeah,
It's, I know it's hard. We're all sort of struggling through that, but I think that's where we are sort of as a species, is we're at this point of like we've got to get past the illusion of self
100%.
to advance both on a, like right now, I don't remember what podcast this was on, but that there was a scientist talking about how the technosphere is destroying the biosphere, and they should
Yeah.
be, which, I didn't had just those terms is interesting. It's like that we're completely reliant on the biosphere to support the technosphere, which supports everything else. So like
Right,
it just makes no sense the way we're doing it,
right.
but it just
It's
requires a shift
crazy.
in consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I feel like we get glimpses of it. Like they just discovered something is being emitted from a planet 120 light years away. And we're all so excited because life is so rare in space. And it's like, if you know it's so rare and you're so excited that it's existing somewhere out there, how do we not operate like it's precious here, like it's rare here?
Oh yeah,
Um, it's really wild. It's
it
yeah,
is
I hope
everything.
there's is
Everything.
a shift soon.
I think we're in it though. It's hard to see. You can't really see it when
Yeah,
you're in it. Like I think just us having this conversation, it maybe 10 years ago would have seemed kind of out there, and people were like, what are they talking about? But I
yeah.
think a lot of people will understand it from across generations. I think I've
I
had,
think,
I
yeah.
think so. Like I've older people, people of like my mom, she's in her 80s. Like we have these kind of conversations, and she's on board, like
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's cool to see, or just people you meet in it. You don't have to use certain terms. I think we all change how we speak depending on who we're talking to.
Right, right.
But I think we all come to the same sort of understanding eventually,
I
right?
think so. I think so. I feel like we're all pretty aware, especially now. I feel like even just getting on the train and some craziness will be in the news and everyone's just kind of like chewing on it. It's like I don't know how to articulate it, but when things are going on in the world, you just sense it. There's a vibrational difference in the space that you're in. But sometimes in that space, I'll notice people being kind to each other, just maybe as a form of protest against the sort of way they're trying to rile us up and have us be against each other. And I feel like that's the answer right there. It's just like try to understand that we're all connected and just be nice and don't be so competitive. Our,
100%.
it's so easy to be competitive. New York is such a,
Oh man, I know,
it's
I
a
know.
rat
I,
race.
I had a moment the other day I'm not proud of. I was getting coming back on the plane from Chicago, from Indiana, and
Hmm.
I like, you got to let the people out in front of you that they're like some older ladies,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I kind of cut in front of them. I wasn't mean about it or anything like that. We kind of
Yeah,
like we
yeah.
had a smile together. But I was like, no, that's like no, just let you gotta let him go. Like no, no, like and I was like chewing on that all day. Like
I
man,
know.
no, you gotta like just be kind in general. I mean, I wasn't a complete jerk, but um
But you
just in
felt
just
it.
I felt it. And it's like
Yeah, yeah.
all this stuff. It's like here's the test, right? Well,
Yeah.
how do you feel? Like
Right.
see for
Right.
yourself. How does it make you feel? Like whatever you're doing,
Yeah.
everything in your life. Like that's why I always come back to the painting process and the creative process because it always makes me feel good in a way
Yeah,
that
yeah.
feels right, you know. And being kind to people and just trying to be good and you have a say a kind word or just be nice to somebody at the store. Little things like that really go a long way. Or
Yeah.
just a little conversation with somebody just to uplift the consciousness a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah. It's so true. And I feel that I'm like more optimistic when I have a regular painting practice. It's very easy to become pessimistic and feel like, oh, we live in samsara for sure. Like this, we're never going to solve this. And then, you have a little bit of enlightenment in the studio and then it makes you want to be kind. And I realize like I have a tendency to smile at people. But when I'm exhausted, obviously I don't have that tendency. And, uh, I realized someone looked at me the other day and smiled, and I don't think my face moved. And I wasn't particularly mean, but I realized like that's that kind of like, New York stare where I probably just was staring through her because I was exhausted and thinking about what I had to do later. And, it's just that's just a
Yeah.
person trying to be human. And
New York's it's a
it's
tough nut to
it's
crack.
tough.
Yeah,
It
it's a
definitely
tough place.
is.
But people are very kind here and people are very
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's a generally it just by the nature of there being so many people,
Yeah, exactly.
it's just impossible to connect with everyone. You know.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah.
do you know Thomas Merton?
Yeah,
He
yeah.
he had this experience. I think there's a statue of it, and he was based in Louisville. He was a
Hmm.
Trappist monk, I believe, for those that don't know.
Hmm.
But he
Hmm.
saw everybody, every consciousness, every person he walked by, he saw them as God. So he wanted to
Mm.
fall at their feet, every person he saw. So
Wow.
so if you had if you true, which is actually probably more accurate, than the way we actually see things as separate and as other. So you can't really function in the world that way. You'd never get home.
Yeah, right.
You get on the
Exactly.
train and you're
Exactly.
just on the train the rest of your life, worshiping everybody you see. But it's
Exactly.
everything too. I think
Yeah.
it's everything also. Everything, the work, the material you're working with, the paint, clearly that's alive, but all the tools you're using, the air around you, all the space, everything is part of the same consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know I was talking with my students a couple weeks ago and I was holding up a rock and I mentioned that it was not just a rock, it was actually compressed sea creatures. It was a black, shiny looking stone, but it was shungite. It came from Russia and it looks like a black pigment that you use in Russian icon painting, but it's actually composed of like millions of little single cell organisms or multicellular organisms that just had this moment. They experienced all this life, and then some sort of extinction event happens and they become compressed and part of the soil. And millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years later, we're grinding it up and making black paint to do watercolors with. Like it's unthinkable in some ways, but then it's also gives you this sense of like, oh wow, this not only is this a living material, this material is composed of like millions of living beings that had histories and experiences of life that I can't even fathom. They touched a period of time that I in some ways haven't in this version of my consciousness, but in other ways have materially. And so there's like I'm connected. It's all part of that same material lineage.
Right, it's miraculous,
Yeah.
truly. Um, well, I want to thank you for spending the time today and for chatting. It was really
Yeah.
a beautiful experience. Before we
Thanks
go,
for
is there
having me.
any, of course, before we go, is there anything you'd like to sort of any advice or anything you'd like to add? Any advice to anyone who wants to live a more creative and fulfilling life, perhaps?
Oh, routines are so important. I realized when I started this business, I stopped painting for almost a year, and it was stressful and depressing. And even though I was surrounded with color and making paints for artists that I admire or friends who I also admire, and I was having a lot of fun that way, I was distancing myself from the sort of practice and the repetition of the practice. And there was one practice that I maintained, and it was drawing. And um, my wife, who's an artist, Winnie Siddhartha, she buys me like bundles of these sketchbooks from Muji that are like the size of a wallet. They fit in your back pocket. And so just having that with me all the time, having it bedside, keeping some type of creative practice that you do regularly, it makes it so much easier when you get back into that space where you have the time and the freedom and the ability to really invest in painting again. So whatever it is, no matter how small, just invest in some form of therapeutic or creative practice. It will help tremendously.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah,
Until
thank you so much, Dan.